Hey guys, Dolphin Bite here. So I watched Braxophone's review on Etheria Restart, which is a relatively new gacha game. I agree with most of his points, although I felt he was a bit harsh and have some small disagreements. So from a more casual, light spender perspective, I want to talk about the game and have a sort of follow-up on his review. To be clear, what I mean by casual light spender is I played the game for about maybe 8 hours actively each week for 2 weeks so far, and spent about $30 to $40, which I feel like is a fair budget for light spending, considering the current gacha climate. My first disagreement with Braxophone is regarding the spending. While dropping 3 months of rent on the game definitely lets you plow through the grinding progression, I felt like he overestimated the value that light spenders get. Now, I bought a couple of the new beginner packs as well as the monthly pass, but I felt like I was getting way too little for what the game was and what the game required to progress. I mean, all I got was a few extra temples and a bit of progression materials, which I didn't feel like made much of an impact other than maybe ascending 2 4 stars that I would have otherwise had to wait for. Fortunately, I did get Shadow Sanya, which isn't even close to being Lily, by the way. But others that spend the same amount could have gotten absolutely nothing. Maybe Braxophone was only referring to whales, in which case I guess the critique would be fair. In either case, for dolphins like me, this honestly makes the game feel even worse than what his original critique was. To be fair to the game though, they do give you a lot of free pulls, like a lot of free pulls for doing the beginner missions and just going through the game. Now onto my second disagreement, and that's regarding the game's art and visuals. While obviously it's mostly up to each person's preference, I think Epic 7's art and visuals are just much better than Theory Restart. Not because I prefer 2D, but I think the costume design is much higher quality. So to me, they seem to have a lot more creative inspiration, and the general art style feels a lot more consistent and premium. You have characters and artifacts that have common themality, you have different factions being represented. Even though Epic 7 doesn't have any open world elements, the overall environment and world building presented just feels like it had a lot more effort. And although it does have its fair share of fantasy and sci-fi tropes, I felt that the world in Epic 7 was just a lot more immersive. Whereas in a Theory Restart, it feels like a generic cyberpunk anime shoved at you in a clunky package of UI menus. Also, in terms of the look and feel within the combat itself, Etheria Restart just lacks that oomph for me. I don't know if it's the way they animate the damage numbers, or the way they animate the health bars, or the sound effects, or the buffs and debuffs, but overall it just doesn't feel that satisfying. Bro, I feel like I'm bashing this game even harder than Braxophone, but I swear it's not my intention. I'm just saying the things that come to mind. While I do agree with his overall assessment on the tedium of the PvE progression, especially without very specific premium characters like Lily, I think he was a bit overly harsh, and I was able to get through most of the early game PvE content using teams that shared around 3 common characters, all of which are guaranteed ones that the game gives you for free. And from what I see online, they're also viable for endgame content as well, but I stopped after 2 weeks and never really got to endgame content, so I can't really speak to that. But more importantly, using those characters didn't really make me feel like I had fun. It was very tedious and very painful to get through the content, which was his original point. In terms of the story mode, I also found it pretty annoying to move through those super closed off domains, but I don't think it was as big of an issue as he made it out to be, because everything was pretty quick to skip through, and there weren't that many story stages in total. I always sneak attack the enemies to make things go faster, which I don't think he mentioned, but most of the gameplay mechanics in the story just felt so forced and unnecessary, like the sensor, the grappling, and the treasure chests. I felt like all those things could have just been packed up into a sequence of battles, and it would have been a lot easier for the player to get through the story, because these things didn't really give me any sense of immersion anyways. One final point that Brax didn't really touch on is the characters and abilities. As someone who played many different turn-based titles before, I felt that the character design was a bit too all over the place. Some abilities just seemed convoluted and unnecessarily verbose, without adding much depth. There was a whole bunch of character unique buffs and debuffs that would just have been more clean as passives or a mix of generic, commonly used status effects. Personally, after the first few characters, I just didn't bother reading the other abilities and went directly to guides on Discord or YouTube. For the more casual player picking this game up from an ad who doesn't want to do hours of research, it's hard to imagine getting past even the early game progression without feeling like it's just not worth the effort. Overall, I do agree with Brax's assessment and would definitely not recommend this game for busy people or light spenders. The progression is super slow and painful, especially without the right characters, and the dailies take way too long. Also, the milestone quests, like the Hyperlink Charter, requires you to branch out to way too many different pieces of content that is painfully gate-kept by character progression. And re-rolling for the best characters give you much better value than dropping $20 on the game, which isn't how you encourage people to spend on the game. But that's just me. What do you think? Are you also a light spender? Do you completely disagree with me and Brax? Let me know in the comments.